Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the rear of the vehicle so the wheels are up and off the ground. After that, if you have one of these center covers, go ahead and use a prying device, carefully get underneath it and pull it off of the wheel. Now once you have it off of there, you're going to continue on to removing all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts. After that, remove the wheel. Let's move along to removing our 2 10mm caliper slider bolts. As you remove any of your mounting hardware, make sure you give it a thorough inspection. If it needs to be replaced, it only makes sense to replace it. Continue on with a pry bar, and we're going to carefully get in between this area of the caliper. What I want to do is gently try to pry, and while I'm prying on the outside here up against the rotor, what I'm looking for is to see the piston of the caliper making its way in. Now once you have plenty of slack in this area, we can carefully roll this off of here. Now it's going to be time to remove the rotor. I always like to take one of my lug nuts and I start it on the stud, just in case when I give this a loving bonk, I don't want it to come flying off and potentially hurt me. Now I'll continue with a hammer. Once it's broken free, carefully remove it from the axle. Now that we have the brakes apart, the next thing that we want to do is move along to the rear differential. When you look at the forward driver's side aspect, you're going to find the fill plug. To remove the fill plug, go ahead and use a 3/8 drive ratchet. I like to use the small extension as well. Go ahead and fully remove this. You're going to want to make sure you have a nice collection bucket under the area just in case the differential is a little overfull. Any fluid that comes out needs to be collected and recycled. Go ahead and give that fill plug a quick inspection. Make sure it's still in usable condition. If it isn't, go ahead and replace it. Ours is fine. Now it's time to move along to the back of the rear differential. We're going to have to remove this entire cover, so go ahead and make sure that you have your collection bucket under this area. There's going to be a lot of differential fluid in here. Keep in mind, once you take this down and the fluid comes out, you're going to have to go ahead and replace it with brand new fluid as well. Now with that said, as we start removing our 13mm headed bolts, you're going to find that generally you're going to have at least 1 tag on it, sometimes 2. Make sure you don't lose that tag. It needs to be reinserted onto one of the bolts. It really doesn't matter which one during the installation process. On your tag, you're going to find a whole bunch of specific writing on it. Generally, this is used in case you need parts or even fluid for the differential. As I make my way around, I like to keep one of my bolts in the very top. That way there, as I fully remove the pan, it'll hang there and I don't have to worry about it falling. Once you have all of your mounting bolts out of there, but left one of them loosely in place, let's continue on to separating the pan from the rear differential. You want to be careful when you do this because typically you're going to find that somebody used a gasket maker all the way around, and that's going to be an adhesive which tries to hold the two together. So as you try to separate, just try not to damage the pan in any way. As that's draining, I'm just going to go ahead and hold onto that pan and fully remove my last bolt. Now we can remove our rear differential cover. Now that we have the pan cover off of here, I want you to pay attention to this long shaft that comes through the center. That essentially is holding everything in place. We need to get that out of here. It's going to go ahead and slide right on through this area. So what we need to do is try turning the drive shaft while the vehicle is in neutral until we can access this 8mm headed bolt. Once you pull this out, you also want to make sure you have this shaft at an angle so that it can go ahead and slide right out diagonally. Once we have it at the proper angle, let's continue with an 8mm wrench. We'll get right on the head of this bolt and we're going to try to turn it counterclockwise to break it free and eventually remove it. Now before I go ahead and fully take out this bolt, I'm going to turn this so it's diagonal like I said. We want to make it so this shaft can barely fit out past the differential. If you go too far, you're going to find you have an issue. I'll pull this out, and we also want to make sure that we do not let this drop and hit the floor. If it drops and hits the floor, it could potentially get broken. I'll hold it in place, remove my bolt, spin it to the proper position. Give this a thorough inspection. Make sure it doesn't look worn or damaged in any way. I'll turn this a little bit. At this point, I'm going to reach up from the top of it and I'm going to gently pull it down. We can slide it right on out of there. Give that a thorough inspection as well. Now, once you have that piece out of there, it's extremely important not to turn any of this. If you try to turn the drive shaft or even any of this area, you're going to make it so things are off time. Inside here are your spider gears, and they can be difficult to get retimed. So just don't go ahead and turn anything. Now with that said, the next thing that we're going to do is make our way out towards where the brakes were. We're going to take that axle and try to push it through towards the center. You're going to see this area start protruding, and you're going to see the locking clip. Now I'll just use a magnet. I'm going to try to pull this off of here. Now once you have it out of there, just give it a close inspection. Make sure it doesn't have any wear grooves into it. This one looks fine. It's just a little bit of paint rubbed off. I'll set it aside. Now we can make our way back out here. Grab onto the axle, give it a little tug, and we're going to carefully remove it from the differential tube. While we're removing it, you want to be inspecting it and wiping it along the way. Once you have it out of there, the next area you want to pay attention to is this area here. The majority of it's where the bearing's going to be, but all the way down closest to here is where the seal's supposed to be. Make sure it doesn't look like it's worn or damaged in any way. Okay friend, whenever you're getting ready to do your rear bearings, you want to make sure that you get yourself a brand new seal as well. Not to mention, make sure you have brand new differential fluid to replace at the same time. At this point, it's time to go ahead and remove the seal from the differential. This can fairly easily be done using something as simple as a pry bar. I'll carefully try to get in behind the seal here without damaging the bearing or the differential tube and gently pry it away. Now it's time to go ahead and remove the bearing from the differential tube. you're going to have to use a puller set to go ahead and get this out of here. You want an adapter that looks a little bit like this. You want to make sure you find one that can fit inside the differential tube, but it does grab up against the bearing itself. I'm just going to take this at an angle, and I'll slide it right on through. Press it up against the inside of that bearing, and then I'll lock it in with my washer and my locking nut. If you don't use the washer and the locking nut, when you try to use the slide hammer on this, there's the possibility the bearings could come shooting out at you or anything that's behind you. Just keep that in mind. Now we'll continue on with our slide hammer. Make sure you screw this all the way in so it's bottomed out. Now at this point, we're going to start trying to slide this hammer back as hard as we can. We want to be very careful not to hurt ourselves in any way. Of course, this is a pinch point. Make sure your fingers do not get pinched. Now I can remove my tool from the bearing. There it is, friends. Once you have the bearing out of there, go ahead and wipe this down carefully. You want to be extremely careful. There could potentially be a burr on the metal. Don't cut yourself. Once it's clean, go ahead and give it a thorough inspection. Make sure you don't see any sharp grooves in there. All right, now it's going to be time to get ready to install our brand new wheel bearing. The first thing you want to do at this point is to compare it to the original. Make sure it's the same outer diameter, and then also make sure it's the same thickness. As you can see, ours is perfect. Let's get ready for the install. We'll carefully place this into the differential tube as straight as possible. After that, you're going to want one of these bearing installers. Find one that fits directly over the bearing, but also goes into the differential tube. You only want to press on the outer aspect of the bearing, never on the inner bearings. I'll line this up perfectly, and I'm going to give it a couple loving bonks with my hammer. What we're doing is we're listening. You're going to hear bonk, 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 and then you're going to hear an audible difference. When you hear the audible difference, that's when the bearing's completely bottomed out inside of the differential tube. You could hear right there, the noise changed. I'll give it one more bonk for good measure. There we are. Now I'm just going to go ahead and give this a little spin. Nothing's binding, and this feels perfect. Now it's going to be time to get ready to install our outer seal. For the seal, you want to pay attention to the inner side right here. If you were to look inside, you're going to find that it has a small spring. When you go to install this, you want to make sure that that does not fall off. It essentially applies pressure from the rubber up against the axle. All I'm going to do is take a little bit of petroleum jelly and make my way all the way around, essentially just to hold it in place. You don't want to use axle grease or anything the like. Petroleum jelly will essentially just melt down and then liquefy and make its way into the gear oil, and that's fine. I'm also going to take some of this petroleum jelly and make my way inside of this inner ring right where the axle is going to sit. Now that we have that well lubricated, let's continue on with some gasket maker. For the gasket maker, we're going to continue by going all the way around the outer aspect of this, directly where it's going to be pressed up against the differential. That's going to create a seal that keeps the moisture out. You need to use some sort of gasket maker. I'm just going to take this, work my way all the way around. Once you have it completely coated, let's get ready to install this into the differential. Let's carefully put this in place up against the rear differential tube. Now we're going to have to drive this in straight and flush up against the differential. I'll just use a flat disc like this and drive it in. Wipe it down, give it an inspection. Looking at it closely, I can tell that this needs to go in a little bit further, so I'll continue. I'm just going to wipe down my mess, make sure that the rubber seal is not damaged in any way, and now we can continue on by adding the proper manufacturer specified fluid. I'm going to come right inside and try to lubricate those bearings. I'll just work it around to make sure everything's well lubricated during the installation process. To be able to tell what type of rear differential fluid you need to use, you're going to want to have a look at the inside or even at the tag that you went ahead and removed. There's two types of fluid. There's either 80-90, which is the type we're going to use on this, or 75-140. The 75-140 gear oil is for a limited slip. Essentially, you're going to find inside of here clutch packs. This doesn't have any clutch pack on either side. That tells me that this is a basic differential. I don't need to use the expensive gear oil and I don't need to use the additive. If you did find that it had a big old brick in here on either side, that means you have to use the expensive 75-140 synthetic gear oil and you have to use a friction modifier. Since we don't have any of that, we can continue on with basic 80-90 gear oil. Now it's going to be time to get ready to install our axle. We're going to slide it from the outside right on through. We're going to keep on going until the seal's lined up with the perfect area here. What you're going to find is the end of the axle is going to make its way all the way in through here, just as it was when we removed it. Once you have it slid through, put in your locking clip. After you have the locking clip into the axle, go ahead and carefully pull the axle away. We're trying to pull this into its locked position. Once it's pulled through, you shouldn't be able to see any of that locking clip. Now let's continue on with a little bit of parts cleaner. I'm only going to try to spray the parts cleaner in the area where my mounting bolt needs to go. Let that dry. Once it's dry, continue on by cleaning up your mounting bolt and applying a thin amount of either yellow or blue thread locker. It's not a good idea to use red, and it's definitely not a good idea to skip using thread locker. Go ahead and wipe this down as well. Thorough inspection, and now we're going to go ahead and slide it up and through. Make sure you have the bolt hole lined up with the bolt hole. Let's go ahead and line that up. Once again, you want to make sure that this does not fall down. Just going to spin this a little bit. Now you want to make sure that you fully tighten this bolt. At this point, you need to make sure that this bolt is nice and tight. I've seen it before where these come loose. This pin can come out. After that, anything can happen. All right, so we're cruising here. Before we continue any further, you need to double check everything we've done. You definitely put the C-clamp in there. You definitely put in the pin. And you used thread locker on the locking bolt and made sure it was tight. After you're sure of all that, continue on with a razor blade or a scraper. You're going to go ahead and clean up any of the existing residue or rust from the rear differential so we can get ready to reinstall our differential pan cover. Before we can put the pan on there, let's continue on by cleaning up all the existing gasket on the area. Give it a thorough inspection, and then we'll continue on with some gasket maker. All the way around, a nice thick bead. We'll put it in place and put on all of our mounting bolts. Before we continue any further, we need to make sure we clean up all of our bolts and our fill plug. Make sure everything's in good condition so we can continue. All right, now we can put our diff pan cover up. You want to pay attention to the area that bubbles out. You need to make sure it lines up with this area. It only makes sense. Go ahead and slide it up into position, line up your bolt holes, and start them all in. Don't forget about that metallic tab. It needs to be placed on any one of the bolts. I'm going to take the tag, put it back where I got it from. Once they're all started, snug them up. Now we're at the point that we can start torquing all of our mounting bolts. When we torque each of these, we're going to torque them to 30 foot-pounds. Torqued. All right, so at this point, we have the cover back on the vehicle. We went ahead and we put some gasket maker on, put in all of our bolts, and we torqued each of them to 30 foot-pounds. Now you need to wait for all that gasket maker to make sure that it's nice and dry. You don't want to go ahead and put in any fluid while it's still wet. If you're using a gasket that isn't the gasket maker, typically you don't have to wait. You can just go ahead and torque it and then put in your fluid. All right, so now that everything's dried, let's make our way to the front driver's side of the differential. We're going to continue on by filling this with the manufacturer's specified fluid. Now, when you fill this, you only want to go ahead and fill it up to the point that you can just barely feel a little bit of it coming up near the top here. So if I stick my finger in, just the tip is going to get a little wet. You don't need to continue filling it till it's all the way full because it's just going to flow right out of the fill plug. Quart number 2. So here's our third quart. Now, as you can see, I have a steady, slow trickle coming from this fill plug hole. It's not coming out fast, and it didn't stop right away, as in I was trying to fill it and it just filled up here and then ran out. I'm just going to double check it with my gloved finger. Oh yeah, that's perfect. Now we can continue on with our fill plug. Before you put it in, make sure you clean and inspect the threads. You don't need to put anything on the threads, such as maybe a thread locker or even a thread sealer. You can just go ahead and put this in and you're going to feel it snug up. Typically it only goes in approximately 3/4 of the way before it's tight. Okay, so right there it feels as though it just bottomed out. Now I don't need to make it too much tighter. I'm just going to carefully grab onto it about halfway down the ratchet. Make sure it's nice and snug without breaking anything. As you can tell, the plug does not screw all the way into the differential. I can still see several threads sticking out, but I know it's tight. At this point, go ahead and clean up your mess. All right, now it's time to start cleaning everything up out here. We're going to continue by cleaning the area of the axle where the rotor is going to sit. Once you have the main surface cleaned down, continue on cleaning in between the studs and the hub. Now before we continue on by putting on our rotor, you want to pay attention to this area right here, the back side of the rotor, right where the axle is going to rest against. You want to make sure you clean this down as well. Let's use some copper never sees. Now we can put our rotor on here. Once you have the rotor slid into position, the next thing you want to do is try to press it directly up against the axle. And while it's up against there, try giving it a little spin. We're trying to listen for a little bit of brake drag coming from those emergency brake shoes. You don't want to have it to the point that it's over tightened and you have too much drag, because drag will cause heat, and of course that's going to cause an issue. I have a very minimal amount of drag right here. This feels good, but if you do have to adjust it, you come along the back side of the backing plate. Go ahead and remove that rubber safety plug here, and then right on the inside, you're going to find the adjuster wheel. will come in right through the hole towards the backside, and then you can just easily de-adjust it by pushing in and lifting up. To adjust it out, you go ahead and press it in and pull it down. As you're doing that, just go ahead and keep testing it and make sure it's just right. Once you have it perfectly adjusted, continue on with your protective cover. Now let's just go ahead and take this and we're going to slide it right on over that caliper. We want to make sure that we slide the doubles down into their position on the bracket and also make sure that the slider pin isn't getting bound up. Once it's fit in perfectly, it should slide into position and you can continue on with your 2 caliper slider pins. We'll continue on with these 2 bolts. When we go to install them, just apply a thin amount of red thread locker to the very end of the threaded areas. After that, start them in, bottom them out. Let's torque each of these to 20 foot-pounds. Let's get our wheel back up on here. We're going to start on all 5 of our 19mm lug nuts. We'll bottom them out and then torque the wheel to 100 foot-pounds. With the wheel safely back down on the ground, let's go ahead and torque these to the 100 foot-pounds in a crisscross manner. Torqued. If you have one of these center covers, go ahead and put it on now. Looking at the backside, you can tell that it has one area that protrudes a little bit differently than the rest. That needs to fit into one of the lug nut holes on the rim. Alright, at this point, we clean down the surface, we double check to make sure it's not leaking in any way. After that, you can go ahead and take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.